The evening began, as so many of our evenings did, with a low-grade, simmering negotiation. It was a silent ballet of persuasion and resistance, a choreography we had perfected over the years. I, the lead, moved through the house in a whirlwind of preparation. A silk dress, a touch of mascara, a final, anxious glance in the mirror. He, the reluctant partner, stood by the doorway of his studio, a smudge of charcoal on his cheek, his posture a quiet, stubborn refusal. "Another one, is he?" Marcus asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was a sigh-given voice. Networking events. To him, they were a special circle of hell, populated by the overly ambitious and the terminally insincere. Crowded rooms that hummed with a frequency he found physically abrasive. He was a man who found his truth in the quiet alchemy of creation, in the patient, solitary act of coaxing beauty from a blank canvas. He spoke in pigments and textures. Their language was one of stock options and synergy. But I thrived in that chaos. The hum that grated on him was a frequency that charged me. The connections, the subtle calibrations of power, the thrill of the strategic conversation, it was my element. It was where I felt most alive, most myself. Tonight's event felt particularly crucial. My boss, a woman who wielded opportunity like a weapon, had dangled a new client in front of me, a name that could catapult my career into a new stratosphere. I needed to be there, and I needed him there. Not as a business partner, not as a wingman. I needed him as an anchor. His quiet, steady presence was a counterbalance to the sharp-edged, performative version of myself I brought to these gatherings. With him in the room, I remembered I was more than just another cog in the relentless, grinding machinery of corporate ambition. The venue was a monument to transient opulence. The Grand Excelsior Ballroom, a cavernous space dripping with counterfeit starlight from a dozen crystal chandeliers. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the collective energy of 1,000 hungry aspirations. Marcus trailed a few steps behind me as we entered, a somber, gray-toned figure in a world of technicolor. I glanced back, offering a smile that was both a reassurance and a plea. He returned it, a faint, fleeting ghost of a smile, and I knew he was already mentally calculating the earliest possible moment of escape. I dove into the crowd, the cool, professional Isabel taking over. Handshakes, practiced pleasantries, the ritualistic exchange of business cards. I was in my element, a swimmer in a familiar sea, navigating the currents of conversation with an ease that felt both natural and entirely constructed. I lost track of Marcus for a while. When I found him, he was where I knew he'd be, at the periphery, near the bar, cradling a glass of red wine like a shield, his artist's eyes taking in the scene with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a strange and baffling tribe. And then I saw him. The recognition was not instantaneous. It was a slow, dawning horror, like watching a forgotten storm cloud gather on a clear horizon. Liam. The name itself was a key to a room in my mind I had kept locked for a decade. A room filled with ghosts I had long ago convinced myself were benign. He hadn't changed. Not really. He still possessed that same effortless, magnetic confidence, an aura that seemed to bend the light and the attention of the room around him. His suit was a masterpiece of understated tailoring, his smile as sharp and dangerous as I remembered. A flicker of something I couldn't, or wouldn't, name ignited in my chest. Nostalgia, perhaps, or maybe just the primitive, physiological alarm of a body remembering a wound. To see him here, in this context, in the carefully constructed world of my present, felt like a temporal paradox, a glitch in the matrix of my life. "Isabel," he said, his voice a smooth, familiar baritone that bypassed my ears and went straight to my memory. "It's been a long time." I summoned the professional Isabel, the one who could navigate any social minefield with a practiced smile. "Liam," I replied, my own voice a convincing imitation of pleasant surprise. What a small world. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in superficiality. We spoke of work, of life, of the 10 years that had vanished since we'd last stood in a room together. But underneath the placid surface of the small talk, a current of unspoken history flowed, strong and treacherous. Liam had a way of focusing his attention on you that felt like a spotlight, and I felt myself, against my will, slipping into the old rhythms, the old patterns. I was mirroring his energy, laughing a little too readily at his jokes, feeling the pull of his social gravity. For a dangerous, intoxicating moment, I forgot who I was, where I was. I was 25 again, reckless and breathless and entirely in his thrall. And then I saw Marcus. He was still across the room, but his gaze was no longer anthropological. It was fixed on me, on us. His expression was a blank canvas, wiped clean of all emotion, which was, I knew, the most damning expression of all. My smile faltered, the laughter dying in my throat. Liam didn't notice. He continued to speak, his voice a low, intimate murmur, but I was no longer listening. The air in the room had changed. The festive hum now sounded like a warning siren. A single, silent glance from my husband had shattered the illusion and brought the ghosts flooding out of their locked room. By the time Liam moved on, leaving me with a charming, "We should catch up," that felt more like a threat than a promise, the damage was done. I sought out Marcus, my steps suddenly heavy, my practiced confidence deserting me. He was still at the bar, his wine glass still full, untouched. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice a brittle imitation of casualness. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second before skittering away. "Fine," he said. But it was not fine. I knew him. I knew the intricate language of his silences, and this silence was a scream. For the first time all evening, a knot of genuine, sickening unease tightened in my chest. This was no longer just another networking event. A fault line had just been exposed, and I was standing on the wrong side of it. In the aftermath of the party, our life resumed its familiar cadence, but it was a rhythm played in a different key. A subtle, discordant note now hummed beneath the surface of our daily routines. Marcus did not mention Liam. I did not mention Liam. This was our way, the silent pact of a long-term marriage. We did not confront the uncomfortable. We allowed it to marinate in the quiet spaces between us, hoping it would either dissolve into insignificance or, as was more often the case, fester into something far more toxic and unmanageable. Then, the ghost from the party materialized in my inbox. It was an email from my boss, her words brisk and authoritative. The high-profile client she had spoken of, the one who could be the key to my future at the firm, was Liam. His new venture capital firm was looking to partner with us, and he had specifically requested me to lead the account. "He trusts you, Isabel." Asterisk my boss had written. Asterisk, make it work. Asterisk, trust. Asterisk the word was a complex, loaded thing. Did Liam trust my professional acumen, or was this a move in a game I didn't know we were playing? A deliberate, calculated re-entry into my life, a test of my composure, my loyalty. I told myself it didn't matter. This was business. This was the opportunity one had been working towards for years. My past with Liam was irrelevant, a footnote in a story that was long over. The first few meetings were a testament to my professionalism. I was prepared, focused, the Isabel who could command a boardroom with quiet confidence. Liam, for his part, was the consummate client, charming, engaged, and respectful of the professional boundary. But underneath the talk of market shares and 5-year projections, there was an unspoken current. The way he would hold my gaze a second too long. The way a small, knowing smile would touch his lips when I made a particularly sharp point. It was as if he were seeing two versions of me at once. The woman in the tailored suit across the conference table, and the ghost of the girl he had once loved. The duality was unsettling. I was good at masking it. But Marcus was not an easy man to deceive. He was an artist, a student of the subtle, the nuanced, the unspoken. He noticed the shift in my energy before I was even consciously aware of it myself. "You've been staying late a lot," he remarked one evening, as I stumbled through the door, an automaton burdened by a laptop bag and a container of takeout. "Big project?" I replied, planting a fleeting, dutiful kiss on his cheek as I brushed past him towards the kitchen. I could feel his eyes on my back, a silent, questioning gaze. I didn't turn around. "Liam's project?" he asked. His tone was perfectly level, yet the question was as sharp as a shard of glass. I froze, my back still to him, my hand hovering over the refrigerator door. The lie was on my tongue, a simple, evasive no, but I couldn't say it. "Yes," I said, my voice too bright, too forced. "Why?" "No reason." But there was a reason. The tension in those two words was a palpable thing, and I could not blame him. If the roles were reversed, if a woman from his past had suddenly become the sole focus of his professional life, a woman whose name was tied to a history of passion and heartbreak, I would not be so composed. But this wasn't about Liam, I told myself, a mantra of self-deception. This was about my career, my future, my ambition. The weeks bled into one another, a grueling marathon of late-night emails, impromptu conference calls, and brainstorming sessions that stretched long past the sunset. Liam's presence became a constant, a dominant thread woven into the fabric of my life. And with each passing day, the quiet, unspoken storm between Marcus and me gathered force. One evening, I came home to find him in the living room, the television on, but his gaze fixed on some distant, interior landscape. "You're late," he said. It was not an accusation, but a flat statement of fact, which was somehow worse. I sighed, the weight of the day pressing down on me. "I told you I had a meeting." With Liam. I hadn't, but it had become the default, the all-encompassing reason for my absence. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes tired but filled with a searching intensity that made me profoundly uncomfortable. "Do I?" he asked, the question so quiet I almost missed it. "Do I know that?" The words landed like a blow. My first instinct was to get defensive, to lash out, to accuse him of being unfair, of not supporting my career. But I couldn't, because deep down, in a place I refused to acknowledge, I knew where his doubt was coming from. Liam was not just an ex-boyfriend. He was a foundational myth in the story of my life. He was the great, passionate, tumultuous love of my youth, the man I had once believed I would build a life with. He was the fire, and Marcus was the hearth. I had chosen the hearth. I had chosen the steady, quiet warmth over the unpredictable, consuming flame. And now, the fire was back, licking at the edges of the safe, comfortable home I had built. "This isn't about Liam," I repeated to myself, a desperate prayer. "This is about me." But as I stood across from my husband that night, seeing the quiet, profound hurt in his eyes, I realized, with a sickening lurch, that I was no longer sure that was true. Liam wasn't just a client. He was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I thought I had left behind. And his reflection was casting a long, dark shadow over the man I had chosen to marry. The erosion of a marriage is rarely a dramatic, seismic event. It is a slow, insidious process, a gradual wearing away of connection, a death by 1,000 unsaid words and unnoticed gestures. My descent into emotional infidelity was not a conscious choice, not a deliberate act of betrayal. It was a drift, a slow, almost imperceptible realignment of my priorities and my attention. At least, that is the story I told myself. The project, Liam's project, became my all-consuming reality. It was a convenient and legitimate excuse for the ever-increasing hours I spent away from home, for the late nights and the working weekends. "It's just work," I would say to Marcus, the phrase a shield I wielded against his quiet, questioning gaze. And I believed it. Or I wanted to. But the evidence of my withdrawal was undeniable. The little rituals that had once been the bedrock of our life together began to crumble. Dinner, once a shared space for recounting our days, became a silent affair, my attention divided between the food on my plate and the insistent buzz of my phone on the table. "Important?" Marcus asked one evening, his voice carefully neutral as my eyes flicked down to the screen for the third time in 5 minutes. "Just an email," I'd reply, the lie so practiced it felt like the truth. I would set the phone down, but leave it face up, a beacon of my divided attention. Another buzz, another subtle, involuntary glance. He said nothing, but his silence was a judgment, a quiet, damning indictment of my shifting loyalties. I began to speak of Liam in a kind of code, or more accurately, I avoided speaking of him at all. I would refer to the project in vague, impersonal terms, scrubbing his name from the narrative of my work life as if the omission itself could render him insignificant. But Marcus was not a fool. When I was forced to mention him, I would see it, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a fractional narrowing of his eyes. He was bracing himself, absorbing the small, repeated blows of another man's name in his home. "He's a perfectionist," I said once, attempting to justify a weekend spent reworking a presentation. "He pushes everyone to be their best." "Sounds exhausting," Marcus replied, his tone unreadable. I laughed, a brittle, joyless sound. "It is. But he did not laugh with me. The geography of our home began to change. He had always been the one to greet me at the door, to take my bag, to ask about my day with a genuine, patient interest. Now, I would often come home to an empty kitchen, the sound of his work in the studio a distant, solitary echo. An invisible wall was being built between us, brick by silent brick, and I was the one supplying the materials. There were other, smaller changes in me, too. I would find myself lingering in the car after pulling into the driveway, a self-imposed decompression chamber where I could scroll through my emails, replay conversations from the day, and bask in the afterglow of a successful meeting. More often than not, those moments involved Liam. He wasn't overtly flirtatious. He didn't need to be. His attention was a more potent form of seduction. The way he would listen, truly listen, when I spoke. The way his eyes would light up with a shared understanding when I made a complex point. The way he remembered small details about me, about my past, details Marcus had never known. He was making me feel seen. He was making me feel like the brilliant, formidable woman I projected at work, not just the tired, distracted wife I had become at home. And that feeling was a dangerous, addictive drug. I told myself it was harmless, a professional rapport, the natural chemistry of two people who had once shared a profound connection. But the truth, the one I kept locked away in the deepest part of my consciousness, was that I had begun to crave his attention more than my husband's. The question, when it finally came, was delivered with a quiet, almost hesitant softness that made it all the more devastating. We were sitting on the couch one night, a chasm of silence between us, the television providing a meaningless flicker of light and sound. "Are you happy, Izzy?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question ambushed me. It was so simple, yet so profoundly complex. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the truth of it was a tangled, ugly thing. I was not unhappy, but I was not happy either. I was restless, and that restlessness was a betrayal of the quiet, stable happiness he had offered me, the happiness I had once cherished. "I'm just tired," I said finally, the familiar, flimsy excuse. He nodded, but his eyes were filled with a deep, knowing sadness. He didn't believe me. And for the first time, I wondered if I was losing not just his trust, but the very foundation of the life I had so carefully built. The argument, when it finally erupted, was not a sudden, violent storm, but the inevitable breaking of a fever that had been raging for weeks. I came home late, a familiar refrain in the discordant symphony of our recent life. The house smelled of garlic and herbs, a scent that was once a comforting welcome but now felt like an indictment. Marcus was at the stove, his back to me, his shoulders a rigid line of unspoken resentment. "You're late," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, which was far more chilling than any accusation. "Meeting ran over," I replied, the lie automatic, tasteless. I slipped off my heels, trying to read the atmosphere in the room. It was thick, unbreathable. "Liam's meeting?" he asked, turning to face me. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, but his eyes were sharp, piercing. A beat of hesitation, a fatal millisecond of indecision that was a confession in itself. "Yes, it's the project." He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to contain a universe of disappointment. "Right, the project." We ate in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence at the table. I attempted small talk, asking about his day, his latest canvas, anything to fill the void. His answers were monosyllabic, clipped. He was waiting. I was the one who finally broke. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my fork clattering against my plate. He looked up, his gaze locking with mine. "Is it just work, Isabel?" The question, the one that had been lurking in the shadows of our marriage for months, was finally out in the open. "What?" I feigned confusion, a pathetic, transparent defense. "Liam," he said, his voice a low, steady current of pain. "Is it just work?" "Yes. Of course, it's just work," I replied, my voice rising, sharp with a defensiveness that only underscored my guilt. "I can't believe you'd even ask me that." He didn't flinch. He just watched me, his artist's eyes seeing straight through the performance. "Do you even hear yourself when you talk about him?" he asked. "What's that supposed to mean?" I snapped, crossing my arms over my chest, a physical barrier against the truth. "It means your face lights up, Izzy. It means you hang on his every word. You defend him. You prioritize him. You come home from a day with him, and you are not here. You are still there. With him. That's ridiculous, I said, the words feeling hollow even as they left my mouth. He is a client. This is my job. He leaned back, exhaling a long, weary sigh. Maybe. But he's not just a client to you, is he? He's a ghost. And you've let him haunt our house. The metaphor was so apt, so painfully accurate, that it stole the breath from my lungs. Liam was a ghost, a specter from my past, and I had not only invited him in, I had given him a seat at our table. I can't do this right now, I said, pushing my chair back, desperate to escape the unbearable weight of his perception. I'm too tired for this. Of course you are, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a quiet, defeated whisper. You're too tired for everything these days. Except him. The injustice of the statement, coupled with its terrible kernel of truth, sent a surge of hot, righteous anger through me. That's not fair. Neither is this, he replied, gesturing to the empty space between us. Whatever this has become, I feel like I'm living with a stranger, Izzy. A polite, distracted stranger who would rather be somewhere else. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream and defend myself and list all the ways he was wrong. But I couldn't, because he wasn't wrong. Not entirely. I stood there, trapped in a cage of my own making, the silence stretching into an eternity. Finally, he stood, his movements slow, weary. He took his plate to the sink. I'm going to bed, he said, his back to me. Good night, Isabel. I was left alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner I hadn't eaten, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. How had we gotten here? How had I allowed the solid, dependable ground of our marriage to erode into this treacherous, crumbling cliff edge? I wanted to follow him, to apologize, to promise to fix it. But I didn't know how. The words felt like lies, even in my own mind. I sat back down at the table, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Marcus was right. Liam was more than just a client. He was a symbol of a life I hadn't chosen, a path I hadn't taken. And I had allowed my fascination with that ghost to jeopardize the living, breathing man who was sleeping alone in our bed. That night, as I lay on the couch, unable to face the cold expanse of our bedroom, I felt the first, terrifying tremor of a true rift. And I had no idea how to stop our world from splitting apart. In the cold, silent aftermath of our argument, the house became a library of memories, and I, a reluctant archivist. The tension with Marcus had created a void, and my mind, seeking refuge or perhaps self-flagellation, rushed to fill it with ghosts. I found myself excavating the ruins of my relationship with Liam, a past I had long ago paved over with the solid, sensible foundation of my life with Marcus. Liam and I had met in that tumultuous, exhilarating period of life between college and true adulthood, a time when identities are still fluid and futures feel limitless. He was a force of nature, a man who vibrated with an energy that was both captivating and slightly dangerous. To be with him was to be swept up in a whirlwind of passion, ambition, and intensity. He didn't just walk into a room, he conquered it. He didn't just have conversations, he held court. He made me feel like the most brilliant, beautiful, and essential person in the universe. And for a young woman still trying to find her own center of gravity, his orbit was intoxicating. Our love was a firestorm. We argued with the same ferocious intensity with which we loved. We pushed each other, challenged each other, and occasionally, we wounded each other. He saw a potential in me I hadn't yet seen in myself, and he relentlessly fanned the flames of my own ambition. Life with him was never calm, never predictable. It was a constant, thrilling ascent. But the same ambition that fueled his passion was also the source of his darkness. He was a competitor in all things, and love was no exception. He was always looking towards the next horizon, the next victory, the next acquisition. And there were times I felt less like a partner and more like a prize he had won, a beautiful object to be displayed as a testament to his success. The end, when it came, was both a shock and an inevitability. A career opportunity arose, one that required him to move across the country, and he chose it. He chose the ascent over me. The shattering of that relationship was a formative wound, a lesson in the transient nature of passion and the cold, hard reality of ambition. Meeting Marcus a year later was like finding a safe harbor after being lost at sea. He was the antithesis of Liam. Where Liam was a whirlwind, Marcus was a mountain, solid, steady, and calm. Where Liam's love was a performance, Marcus's was a quiet, consistent presence. He did not seek to conquer me or change me. He sought to understand me. With him, I did not have to perform. I did not have to compete. I could simply be. The peace he offered was a balm to my wounded soul, and I mistook that peace for a lesser form of love. I chose the safety, the stability, the quiet, dependable warmth of the hearth. But now, Liam's reappearance had thrown that choice into stark, unsettling relief. He had reawakened a part of me I had willingly put to sleep. The restless, ambitious, thrill-seeking girl who had once been so drawn to his fire. I found myself, to my shame, drawing comparisons. Marcus, my rock, my steadfast partner, suddenly seemed quiet, predictable, safe. The very qualities that had once been his greatest virtues now felt like limitations. This line of thought was a betrayal, I knew. It was a profound injustice to the good, kind man who had patiently helped me rebuild my life. Marcus deserved better than to be a supporting character in the nostalgic drama of my past. He was not a consolation prize. He was my husband. I remembered our first kiss. Not the fiery, desperate kiss of my youth with Liam, but a slow, deliberate, and deeply tender kiss on a quiet, starlit night on my apartment balcony. It had been a kiss that promised not a whirlwind, but a lifetime. As I sat there, lost in the labyrinth of my own history, I felt a pang of longing. Not for Liam, the man, but for Isabel, the girl. The girl who was fearless, who was not afraid to want things, who had not yet learned to equate safety with happiness. Somewhere along the line, in the process of building a secure and stable life, I had misplaced her. Marcus entered the room, interrupting my reverie. He saw the wine glass in my hand, the distant, haunted look in my eyes. He said nothing, but the weight of his unasked questions was a physical presence between us. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice gentle. "Just tired," I said, the lie now so familiar it felt like a second skin. He nodded, but he didn't believe me. He knew I was somewhere else, with someone else, even if only in my own mind. That night, as I lay in the cold expanse of our bed, I felt trapped, not by my marriage, as I had once feared, but by my own unresolved past. I was caught between two men, two lives, two versions of myself. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that I could not move forward until I made a choice. Not between Liam and Marcus, but between the woman I was and the woman I wanted to be. The argument was a rupture, a violent tearing of the fabric of our shared life. In its wake, the silence that fell over our home was not a peaceful one. It was the dead, hollow silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, littered with the casualties of unspoken resentments and undeclared wars. Marcus and I became ghosts in our own home, orbiting each other in a state of pained, polite distance. We were roommates who shared a history, a mortgage, and a profound, unbridgeable chasm of misunderstanding. At work, the project became my refuge, a place where the rules were clear and my value was quantifiable. But the refuge was also the source of the poison. Every interaction with Liam was now fraught with a new, terrible significance. His easy charm, his knowing smiles, his casual compliments, they were no longer just part of his professional persona. They were pieces of evidence in the case Marcus was building against me in his own mind. I felt a constant, low-grade guilt, not because I had crossed a line, but because I was so acutely aware of where the line was, and how often I found myself dancing along its edge. At home, the silence was an active, malevolent force. Every glance from Marcus was heavy with a weight I couldn't decipher. Every meal was a pantomime of normalcy, a hollow ritual performed without joy or connection. I was drowning, and the worst part was, I didn't know if I wanted to be saved. One evening, I found myself sitting on the sofa, a glass of wine in my hand, staring at a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was from our wedding. We looked so young, so impossibly happy, so utterly convinced of our own invincibility. When had that couple disappeared? When had we become these two sad, silent strangers? I thought back to the early days, to the easy laughter, the shared dreams. Marcus and I were different, yes. He was the earth, and I was the sky. He was content, and I was restless. But our differences had once been complementary, a source of balance. He had grounded my ambition, and I had broadened his horizons. Now, those same differences felt like insurmountable barriers. My ambition, I realized with a sudden, painful clarity, had become a third party in our marriage. I had poured all my energy, all my passion, all my focus into my career, into proving my worth in a world that constantly demanded more. And in the process, I had left Marcus with the emotional dregs, the exhausted, distracted remnant of the woman he had married. The argument replayed in my mind, his words a relentless, tormenting echo. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't even know why. He wasn't wrong. I felt it too, this slow, agonizing dissolution of the bond that had once been the center of my universe. And Liam was a phantom limb, an ache for a part of myself I thought had been amputated long ago. He represented the path not taken, the life of passion and intensity one had consciously turned away from in favor of Marcus's quiet, steady love. But was it love? Or had I simply chosen him because he was safe, because he would never leave me for a better offer, because he would never shatter my heart the way Liam had? The thought was a betrayal of the deepest kind, and it filled me with a sickening wave of self-loathing. I loved Marcus. I knew I did. But love, I was beginning to understand, was not a passive state of being. It was an active choice, a daily practice. And I had stopped practicing. I had stopped choosing him. As I sat there, the wine turning sour in my mouth, I knew I was at a precipice. I had spent so much time looking outward, at my career, at the ghost of Liam, at the life I thought I should have, that I had completely neglected my inner world. I had stopped asking myself the hard questions. What did I truly want? What did I value? Was the thrill of ambition worth the cost of my marriage? The answer should have been simple, but my heart was a tangled, complicated mess. That night, as I lay on the couch, unable to bear the cold silence of our bedroom, I knew I could not continue this way. I had to make a choice, not between two men, but between two versions of my life. The one I was chasing, and the one that was quietly, patiently waiting for me to come home. It was a terrifying prospect, confronting the wreckage I had created. But the alternative, losing Marcus, and in the process, losing the best part of myself, was infinitely more so. The silence in our house had become a living entity, a third resident that occupied the space between Marcus and me. It was a heavy, suffocating presence, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and galvanizing, that I had to be the one to break it. I could no longer live in this state of polite, pained detachment. The days leading up to our conversation were a blur of internal negotiation. The fear of confrontation, of saying the wrong thing, of making things irreparably worse, was a powerful paralytic. But the fear of losing him, of watching our marriage dissolve into a quiet, resentful nothingness, was stronger. I saw him not just as my husband, but as a man in pain, a pain I had largely caused. I saw the way his shoulders slumped when he thought I wasn't looking, the way the light had dimmed in his usually warm, kind eyes. He was not just angry, he was grieving. He was grieving the loss of the wife he thought he knew, the partnership he thought was solid. My work, my ambition, my unresolved history with Liam, they were not excuses. They were components of the complex, selfish machinery that had driven me to neglect the most important person in my life. The realization was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, painful dawning. I had been so focused on proving I could have it all that I had failed to appreciate what I already had. One evening, I sat on the sofa, my phone on the coffee table beside me. It buzzed with a message from Liam. A simple question about a project detail. A few weeks ago, I would have answered it instantly. Tonight, I looked at his name on the screen, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No flicker of nostalgia, no jolt of excitement. Only a profound, weary sense of anachronism. He belonged to a different story, a different chapter of my life. I set the phone down, face down, and did not reply. Marcus came home late that night, a rarity for him. He moved through the kitchen with a quiet, deliberate slowness, as if the very act of being in our shared space was a burden. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned, his expression guarded. "We need to talk." He nodded, a slow, weary motion, and sat in the armchair opposite me. The space between us felt like a mile. I took a deep breath, the words I had rehearsed 100 times in my head suddenly feeling inadequate. I know things have been broken between us. I began, my voice trembling slightly. And I know that I am the one who broke them. He said nothing, his gaze unwavering, waiting. I let my work, my ambition, I let it consume me. I continued, the confession a painful, necessary release. I started to believe that my value was tied to my success, and I stopped seeing the value in us, in the quiet, beautiful life we had built. And Liam, I faltered, his name a difficult, bitter taste. He was a ghost, a reminder of a person I used to be, a person I thought I missed. But I was wrong. I wasn't missing her. I was just using her as an excuse to avoid dealing with my own dissatisfaction. I finally looked up and met his eyes. They were filled with a profound, bottomless sadness. I have been a terrible wife to you, Marcus. I have been distant and selfish, and I have made you feel like you were not enough. And that is the most unforgivable thing of all, because you are more than enough. You are everything. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and shameful. I don't know if it's too late, I whispered. I don't know if you can ever forgive me. But I had to tell you. I had to tell you that I see it. I see the mess I've made. And I am so sorry. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of my confession, the raw, unvarnished truth of my failure. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in weeks. I have missed you, Izzy, he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The real you, not the corporate warrior, not the ghost of Liam's past. Just you. It was not an absolution. It was not a promise. But it was an opening. A small, fragile crack in the wall that had been built between us. The next morning, I made a choice. I walked into my boss's office and I told her I was reassigning Liam's account. She was not pleased. There were veiled threats about my future at the firm. I did not care. As I walked out of her office, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. When I got home that evening, Marcus was in his studio. I stood in the doorway and just watched him for a moment. This quiet, brilliant, patient man who had weathered my storm without abandoning the ship. I'm home, I said softly. He turned, a small, tentative smile touching his lips. Welcome back, he said. It was not an end. It was a beginning. A slow, difficult, and profoundly necessary journey back to each other. The conversation was not a magic wand. It did not instantly erase the months of neglect, the silent resentments, the chasm that had opened between us. It was, however, a ceasefire. It was an agreement to lay down our arms, my ambition, his wounded pride, and survey the battlefield of our marriage to see what, if anything, was worth salvaging. The weeks that followed were a delicate, often clumsy, dance of reconnection. We talked, truly talked, with a raw, painful honesty we hadn't shared in years. We spoke of my restlessness and his loneliness, of my need for external validation and his quiet fear of being left behind. We excavated the foundations of our relationship and found that while there were significant cracks, the structure itself was still sound. I made tangible changes. Reassigning Liam's account was the first and most significant. It was a clear, unambiguous statement of my priorities. My career was important, but it would no longer be the ruling deity in the pantheon of my life. I started leaving work at a reasonable hour. I turned off my phone during dinner. I learned to be present, not just in body, but in mind and spirit. Marcus, in turn, began to slowly lower his defenses. He started talking about his art again, sharing his frustrations and his small victories in the studio, a part of his life he had quietly closed off from me during the worst of our estrangement. He began to greet me at the door again, not with the wary caution of a man bracing for disappointment, but with the quiet, welcoming smile of a husband who was happy to see his wife. We brought back the small rituals, the quiet, mundane acts of love that had been the first casualties of our Cold War. Sunday morning pancakes, a tradition we had let lapse, were reinstated. We would stand in the kitchen, side by side, the air filled with the scent of batter and coffee, and the easy, comfortable silence of two people who were once again in sync. We took long walks after dinner, our hands finding their way back to each other, a simple, profound act of reconnection. There were still hard moments. There were days when the ghost of my betrayal would linger in the air, when a careless word or a moment of distraction on my part would cause him to retreat back into his shell of quiet hurt. And there were days when I would feel the old, familiar pull of my ambition, the restless desire for more, and I would have to consciously, deliberately, choose him. Choose us. One evening, we were sitting on the sofa, a comfortable silence between us, when he turned to me. "Why now, Izzy?" he asked, the question genuine, not accusatory. What really changed? I thought for a moment, wanting to give him an answer that was as honest as his question. "I think," I said slowly, "I was so busy trying to prove that I was enough for the world, that I forgot that I was already enough for you. I was chasing a version of success that had nothing to do with happiness. I almost lost the only thing that truly mattered because I was afraid of being content." He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I don't need you to be a CEO, Izzy. I just need you to be my partner." The words were a quiet, powerful absolution. Months later, we found ourselves at another party, a casual backyard barbecue at a friend's house. The air was filled with the scent of charcoal and freshly cut grass, the sound of children's laughter. It was the antithesis of the stuffy, corporate galas that had once been my domain. Marcus was in his element, deep in a conversation about woodworking with a friend, a genuine, relaxed smile on his face. I stood back and watched him, my heart filled with a profound and quiet gratitude. I felt a hand on my arm. It was Clara. "You look happy," she said, her eyes searching mine. "I am," I replied, and the words were the truest I had ever spoken. It was not a perfect, storybook ending. Our marriage would always bear the scars of that difficult year. But the scars were a reminder not of the wound, but of the healing. We had walked through the fire and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger, more honest, and more deeply connected than ever before. We had chosen each other, not out of comfort or safety, but with a clear-eyed understanding of what it meant to love, to fail, and to begin again. And in that choice, we found our way back home.